a dog wouldn't stop barking at his pregnant owner's belly. When they discovered the reason, everyone was in shock. Lucy and Mark woke up that morning feeling both serene and excited. The sun lit up the small dining area of their apartment, where they sat down for breakfast with the enthusiasm typical of those awaiting a momentous event. Lucy, who was 7.5 months pregnant, kept her hands resting on the table as she looked at Mark with a gentle smile. Just imagining their first baby's face filled both of them with a happiness that seemed almost tangible in the air. From time to time, Lucy thought that nothing could overshadow that radiant morning. Meanwhile, on the floor, Toby, the family's Labrador, wagged his tail with boundless energy. He had always been their most loyal companion, and now that Lucy was pregnant, he seemed even more attached to her, as if he knew someone very special was on the way. With every step Lucy took, Toby's ears perked up with curiosity, following her shadow and trying to press his snout against her growing belly. Mark poured himself a bit more coffee, though he knew he should limit his caffeine intake. The anticipation of impending fatherhood kept him in a strange mix of nerves and joy. He looked at Lucy while she brought a piece of toast to her mouth and noticed a special sparkle in her eyes. It had become common for Lucy lately. She radiated a kind of warmth that spread to everyone around her. Mark felt fortunate to have her by his side and to be sharing this unique moment with her. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen when, suddenly, Lucy's phone started ringing. She raised an eyebrow, wondering who would call so early. The screen showed the name Julia, her colleague and friend from the school where they both worked. Lucy had been on preventative rest for a few weeks by medical advice, though she hadn't officially started her maternity leave. She was usually an active woman, always eager to plan lessons and share ideas, but the pregnancy had forced her to slow down. "Julia, good morning," Lucy answered cheerfully, carefully getting up from the chair to take the call in the next room. Mark and Toby stayed in the kitchen. Right away, the dog sniffed in the direction of the door, watching his owner go. On the other end of the line, Julia asked anxiously if Lucy planned to come back for at least a few more days before her full maternity leave started. The school was worried about not having a permanent substitute, and the administration hadn't managed to finalize the right person. Lucy sighed. She felt torn. On the one hand, she missed her students and the routine of teaching. On the other, she knew she had to take care of herself and focus on her health, as the pregnancy was beginning to require more attention and rest. "Well, I haven't fully decided yet," Lucy replied hesitantly. "My doctor recommended I stay home and avoid stress. Maybe I could visit the school one day to help with lesson planning, but I don't want to risk my health or the baby's." Julia understood, though she begged Lucy not to dismiss the idea of helping out virtually at least. With the school nearing the end of the term, any assistance would be greatly appreciated. Lucy promised to think about it and keep in touch. When she hung up, she returned to the kitchen, where Mark greeted her with a sympathetic look. "What did Julia say?" he asked, stroking Toby's head. The dog had sat by his side, watching intently. Lucy explained the situation, while Toby approached her legs. She couldn't help but smile when the dog pressed his snout affectionately against her belly. Until then, Toby had done nothing but give her a sense of security, as if he were protecting something very valuable. Lucy leaned down a bit to scratch his ears and felt her own heart speed up. The future was challenging, but at the same time, it was brimming with hopes that filled the house with light. For a moment, Lucy recalled how they had adopted Toby when he was just a frightened puppy. She and Mark had passed by the dog shelter, and upon looking into his eyes, they couldn't resist taking him home. Over time, Toby became an essential part of their daily life. He accompanied Mark on his morning runs and played with Lucy when she returned from teaching. Now, with the pregnancy advancing, the dog seemed more focused on Lucy than ever. They finished breakfast and cleared the table. As usual in the mornings, Mark said goodbye before leaving for work, not without first kissing Lucy on the forehead and promising to come home early to take her to a routine checkup. Lucy nodded, delighted to see how much Mark was trying not to miss any detail of their sweet anticipation. Toby followed Mark to the door, barking softly as if wishing him a good day. Then he went back to Lucy, who stood by the window for a moment, gazing outside. The sun illuminating her belly seemed to reflect the hopes they both held, the arrival of a child who would change their lives forever. Once the house was quiet, Lucy allowed herself a moment of introspection. She noticed how her daily routine had subtly changed. She slept more, walked less, and spent time talking to her belly, imagining a future with that baby she already loved unconditionally. She remembered Julia's call and wondered if going back to school for a few days was a good idea. She wanted to make the most of her energy while she still had it, but she also worried about pushing her body too hard. Fortunately, the atmosphere at home remained calm and filled with optimism. Lucy knew that if she had any doubts, she could consult her doctor and Mark, both always ready to protect and advise her. As she stroked her belly, Toby gently licked her hand, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. That ordinary scene was proof of how good they all felt, enveloped by the joy that came with the impending arrival of a new member of the family. With anticipation pulsing in every corner of her home, Lucy sighed and moved toward the living room couch to sit down for a while. Toby followed her closely, wagging his tail with a steady rhythm that filled the space with a soft thumping sound. It seemed like a perfectly normal day, full of the sweetness and serenity that often come before big changes. And indeed, everything seemed calm. No one could have imagined that, in just a few hours, something as simple as a dog's bark would completely alter that peaceful routine. The morning passed peacefully until the arrival of Casey, Lucy's younger sister, who showed up shortly after Mark returned from the office. Casey was usually a source of endless optimism and curiosity, and that day was no exception. She entered the house carrying a bouquet of spring flowers and a cake, saying she wanted to celebrate the baby's upcoming arrival. Seeing Lucy's belly, she couldn't help but let out a cry of joy. "Look how much you've grown!" Casey exclaimed, setting the cake on the dining room table. "This little one seems like they'll arrive sooner than we think. How are you feeling?" Lucy shrugged, giving a shy smile. Although her pregnancy was going well, she had recently started experiencing some back cramps and more fatigue than usual. She didn't want to worry anyone, so she just nodded and joked about how heavy the days sometimes felt. While she spoke, Toby approached her with curiosity. He wagged his tail as usual, but every now and then he tilted his head slightly, as though sensing something different. Mark came over to greet Casey and offer her something to drink. She accepted a glass of juice, promising to share the latest family news. Her visit also aimed to go over the details for the soon-to-be baby shower and to make sure Lucy was doing well. It wasn't the first time Casey had dropped by unannounced, but her intentions were always good, and Lucy appreciated it. She wanted to be surrounded by loved ones in those final months of pregnancy. After a few minutes of conversation, Lucy began to feel a slight tiredness and decided to lie down on her favorite armchair in the living room. That chair had been her refuge in recent months. There she did crossword puzzles, read books on motherhood, and dozed off when sleepiness overcame her. Casey followed her sister and settled on the sofa nearby, while Mark remained standing, listening to both of them laugh and brainstorm possible baby names. Toby, for his part, lay down at Lucy's feet, stretching out with a relaxed sigh. The atmosphere was warm and jovial until, suddenly, Toby stood up and let out a short, sharp bark. Lucy opened her eyes in surprise and looked at the dog, thinking maybe he was hungry or needed to go outside. But Toby was staring at her intently, head tilted. Then he leaned in to sniff her belly and, without warning, began to bark insistently. "Toby, stop!" Lucy exclaimed, somewhat startled. She tried to quiet the dog by raising her hand, but he kept barking even louder. "Is he all right?" Casey asked, getting to her feet. Mark stepped closer too, trying to figure out what was causing this sudden behavior. Toby wouldn't quit. His barks echoed off the walls, filling the room with a sound that rang in everyone's ears. Lucy felt a sudden discomfort, a strange pressure in her lower back that she couldn't immediately place as either normal or concerning. However, the immediate focus was on the dog, whose behavior was completely unlike his usual calm and loving demeanor. "Maybe he's jealous," Mark suggested, trying to stay calm. Some animals react that way when they notice all the attention going to something else. In this case, the baby. Casey didn't seem convinced. She had known Toby since he was a puppy and had never seen him bark so frantically without reason. She tried to reach out to calm him, but Toby backed away, ears alert, eyes fixed on Lucy. It was as though he was trying to send a message no one could decipher. Feeling exhausted and rattled by the noise, Lucy slowly rose from the chair, placing a hand on her belly in an attempt to soothe the pressure she felt. Each time she tried to take a step, Toby circled around her, growling softly, a barely audible but tense sound. Casey watched with a furrowed brow, and Mark, though more skeptical, was beginning to feel uneasy. "Maybe Toby is reacting to some change he senses in you," Casey suggested, recalling stories she'd heard about animals detecting certain movements or hormonal shifts. "I've read that dogs can be very perceptive, especially with their owners." Lucy silently agreed, acknowledging her sister might be right, yet she didn't know how to interpret Toby's barking. She couldn't recall any recent change in her routine that might trigger the dog's anxiety. Besides, Toby's gaze wasn't aggressive. It was alarmed, as if he were trying to warn them about something only he could perceive. The racket lasted for several more minutes, until Mark gently took Toby by the collar and moved him away from Lucy. The dog resisted a bit, but finally quieted down, letting out one final bark that reverberated through the living room. Then he stood at a distance, watching his owner with a motionless tail. An awkward silence settled over them. "I'm worried about you," Mark said, placing his hand on Lucy's forehead. "Does anything hurt? Are you okay?" "Just a little discomfort," she answered, trying to play it down. Yet Toby's behavior had left her with an uneasy feeling that was hard to ignore. Casey, who always tried to find logical explanations, looked thoughtful. Although she didn't want to alarm her sister, she knew this behavior was too unusual to brush off as simple jealousy or a doggy whim. She suggested taking Toby to the vet in the coming days to make sure he wasn't sick or stressed for some unknown reason. Despite the tension, the conversation tried to recover the pleasant tone from before, with Casey telling family anecdotes and Mark attempting to lighten the mood with a joke or two. Lucy, however, continued to feel a persistent unease. Every time she rested her hand on her belly, she remembered Toby's furious barking and penetrating gaze, as though he sensed something she knew nothing about. Casey decided to leave after a while, advising her sister to get some rest and to call the doctor if the mild pain she was feeling grew more intense. Lucy promised she would and walked her to the door with a forced smile. Mark also said goodbye, assuring Casey that everything would be fine. When silence returned to the house, Lucy wanted to lie down on the couch again. Mark came over to help her sit, and with a loving gesture, he reached out toward Lucy's belly, hoping to feel the baby's gentle kicks. In that very moment, Toby let out a low growl, fixing his gaze on Mark's hand before looking him in the eye with unusual fierceness. The growl felt like a warning, a sound that made their skin crawl. Mark pulled his hand away, incredulous, while Lucy looked at the dog with her heart pounding. Neither knew what to say. Toby had gone from being their most faithful protector to an enigma that filled the house with dark premonitions. However, they still had no idea that behind those first barks lay something far more important than a mere shift in the dog's mood. The day after Casey's visit was marked by uncertainty. Mark and Lucy woke up with the same question on their minds. What was happening with Toby? The dog remained affectionate most of the time, but whenever Lucy settled into the armchair or Mark tried to touch her belly, Toby tensed up and sometimes let out a growl or barked insistently. It was as strange as it was unsettling, given that just a few days earlier, Toby had been the most loyal and gentle of companions. That morning, Lucy began her day with a slight backache, nothing severe, but not a typical pregnancy discomfort either. Even so, she tried to carry on with her routine. She reviewed some notes from school, drank herbal teas, and spent some time resting in the living room. Meanwhile, Mark decided the best course of action was to book an appointment with Don Jacob, the trusted veterinarian who had been treating Toby for several years. They wanted to rule out any health issues before jumping to more complicated theories. "Yes, we have an opening this afternoon," Mark confirmed over the phone after speaking to the clinic's receptionist. "We'll be there at 5. Lucy was relieved they would soon get a professional opinion. Despite everything, she hoped it was simply a minor behavioral quirk in Toby, perhaps triggered by changes at home or the baby's imminent arrival. Still, she couldn't ignore a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Ever since the dog had started barking strangely, she felt more fatigued herself, with an intermittent pang in her lower abdomen. At the appointed time, they got in the car with Toby in the back seat. The dog gazed out the window, tongue hanging out, as though expecting a normal outing. Mark drove while Lucy anxiously squeezed his hand. They barely spoke during the journey, both preoccupied by the memory of Toby's recent bouts of barking and growling. When they arrived at the clinic, Don Jacob greeted them with a friendly smile. He was an older man, with grey hair and a gentle voice, well known in the neighborhood for his excellent rapport with animals. After the usual greetings, he invited Mark and Lucy to step into the exam room with Toby, who seemed a bit on edge at the sense of other dogs and cats. "Let's see," the veterinarian said, carefully running his hands along Toby's back. "Tell me in detail what's been going on." Mark looked at Lucy, encouraging her to explain. She described how Toby had suddenly begun barking persistently, especially whenever she settled into the armchair or when Mark tried to touch her belly. She recounted the dog's anxious expression, the tension in his body, and his low growl that seemed to come from nowhere. Don Jacob listened attentively, narrowing his eyes as he concentrated. "It's long been known that dogs are very sensitive to changes," the veterinarian remarked, after examining Toby with his stethoscope. "But before concluding anything, I want to be sure there's no physical pain causing this." The examination was thorough. Don Jacob took Toby's temperature, checked his ears, teeth, and joints. Each step revealed a perfectly healthy dog. Toby showed no aggression during the checkup and didn't complain about any of the handling. In fact, he licked the vet's hand in a submissive, trusting gesture. "I don't see anything unusual in Toby," Don Jacob said after finishing his exam. "He's in perfect shape." Lucy and Mark exchanged glances, relieved their pet was healthy, yet puzzled by the barking's origin. Then, removing his gloves, Don Jacob leaned against the exam table and said in a serious tone, "Sometimes dogs sense things in their owners. They can pick up hormonal changes, moods, or even minor health imbalances. They might get nervous when they notice something we overlook." His words echoed in Lucy's mind. She remembered stories about dogs that had sensed illnesses in their owners. Mark frowned, trying not to jump to hasty conclusions. Still, he couldn't help feeling a slight chill at the thought that Toby might be trying to warn them about something. "Do you think?" Mark began to ask, but Don Jacob merely shrugged. "I can't say for sure. All I know is that Toby isn't sick. It could be a reaction to the pregnancy itself, but keep an eye out for any other symptoms at home." They thanked the vet, paid for the consultation, and left with the certainty that Toby was physically fine. Lucy paused at the door, looking at her dog with a mixture of confusion and fondness. Toby, in turn, lifted his head and fixed his dark eyes on her, conveying a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. They drove home as the sun began to set. The slow traffic gave them time to think, although neither spoke much. Eventually, Mark broke the silence, his voice reflective. "Do you think Toby is trying to alert us to something?" Lucy sighed, softly rubbing her belly. She felt a lump in her throat as she recalled the pains which, though mild, kept hovering in the background. She tried not to sound worried, so as not to alarm Mark, but she also felt compelled to share what was on her mind. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "The vet said that sometimes dogs detect things we don't. Maybe Toby's..." trying to tell me I need to take better care of myself. When they got home, they found a packet of advertising flyers and their latest electric bill in the mailbox. Mark grabbed them, and they entered together, accompanied by Toby, who walked calmly, as though the bizarre episode of relentless barking was already behind them. However, as soon as they stepped into the living room, Lucy felt another twinge of back pain, coupled with a brief wave of dizziness. Toby turned his head toward her, ears perked with interest. Minutes ticked by, and the afternoon passed in silence. Lucy decided to call Casey to share the results of the vet visit. As expected, her sister reacted immediately. "I told you I'd do some research on the internet," Casey said. "There are documented cases of dogs detecting cancer, epileptic seizures, or high-risk pregnancies. I don't want to worry you, but I think you should see your doctor just to rule out anything unusual." Lucy promised she would. As much as she tried not to be alarmed, Casey's words, along with Don Jacob's, strengthened the idea that Toby might be sensing a problem with his owner. That night, before bed, Lucy lay next to Mark, and together they went over the latest events, feeling as though a cloud of uncertainty had gathered over the peaceful wait for their first child. "The vet says Toby is perfectly healthy," Mark murmured, switching off the lamp. "If he's fine, then why is he acting like that?" Lucy didn't know how to respond. She stroked her belly tenderly and sighed. Toby, resting on his bed near the door, pricked up his ears at the sound of her voice, almost as if he were standing guard. The dog's silent gaze closed out the night with a troubling question. If Toby wasn't the one with the problem, then there remained the unsettling possibility that the real issue lay with Lucy herself. Lucy woke up the next morning with a strange heaviness in her body. For days, she had been feeling a weariness beyond what was normal, and the previous night she'd barely slept because of intermittent twinges in her lower back. Even so, she got up carefully, got dressed, and went to the kitchen to prepare some tea. Toby, who usually greeted her by vigorously wagging his tail, approached with a hint of worry in his eyes. Lucy tried to pet him to calm him, but he kept his ears alert, monitoring her every move. That behavior was becoming a pattern, and Lucy no longer knew whether it was something temporary or a sign that something was actually going on in her own body. Wanting to deal with that uncertainty, Lucy decided to call Dr. Johnson, her regular physician, to discuss the mild discomfort she'd been experiencing. Although she wasn't one to panic, the combination of back pain, persistent fatigue, and Toby's odd behavior made her want to be cautious. The doctor scheduled her for that same morning to see if there was any real cause for concern. When Lucy told Mark, he urged her not to wait, reminding her that both her health and the baby's were their top priority. At the clinic, Dr. Johnson greeted her warmly and asked her to lie down on the exam table for a thorough checkup. After examining her belly, taking her blood pressure, and listening to the baby's heartbeat, he reassured her that he saw nothing out of the ordinary at that moment. However, upon hearing Lucy describe the lower back pain and her extreme tiredness, he decided to order blood and urine tests. While he hadn't detected any alarming signs in the physical exam, he preferred to rule out any infection or nutritional deficiency that could affect the final stage of pregnancy. Lucy agreed, grateful for his attentive care. Leaving the clinic, she felt somewhat relieved, though she couldn't ignore the lingering shadow of doubt. She recalled Don Jacob's words about how dogs sometimes perceive health changes in their owners before they become evident. And that wasn't all. Her sister Casey had reinforced the idea by searching the internet for numerous accounts of dogs detecting diseases or internal changes. Lucy didn't want to get upset, but with each new bark from Toby, she felt a growing sense of unease she couldn't fully articulate. Meanwhile, Mark's workday at the office was somewhat unusual. While he was attending meetings and reviewing his team's proposals, his colleague Victor approached him at lunch to ask how everything was at home. Reluctantly, Mark recounted Toby's latest episodes of barking at Lucy's belly and how they had already visited the vet. Victor, who had a practical mindset and a somewhat sarcastic sense of humor, raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "Come on, Mark," he said with a laugh. "I think you and your wife are making too big a deal out of this. My dog used to bark at the couch or at the oven whenever it turned on by itself, and there was nothing mysterious about it. Maybe Toby notices Lucy is moving differently because of the pregnancy, or maybe everyone's just more focused on her belly. It's only normal that he's uneasy, don't you think?" Mark shrugged, trying not to take Victor's jokes too personally. Even so, he couldn't help feeling a little foolish for sharing a story that might seem far-fetched. He said goodbye to Victor with a friendly nod and went back to his tasks. Deep down, though, he didn't think his concern was unfounded. He vividly remembered how Toby had barked the day before with an intensity that didn't match mere curiosity or jealousy. That afternoon, Lucy returned home somewhat tired from her tests. She settled into the armchair with a soft sigh of relief. Toby was in the living room, stretched out on the rug, and got up as soon as he saw her enter. Lucy felt a small twinge in her lower abdomen as she sat down, so quick and fleeting that she thought it was just another of those minor aches common in late pregnancy. She remained still for a few seconds, hand on her belly, breathing deeply to shake off the discomfort. However, that gesture seemed to trigger something in Toby that Lucy couldn't understand. The dog, who had come over to sniff her arm, suddenly stood up, tensed his front legs, and let out a sharp, loud bark aimed squarely at his owner's belly. Lucy jumped at the explosive sound. She tried to calm him by calling his name, but Toby continued with a series of barks that echoed off the living room walls. Just then, Mark walked into the house. He had left work early, worried about Lucy's doctor's appointment. Hearing the commotion, he dropped his jacket and rushed into the living room. He found the scene they'd grown accustomed to lately, Lucy on the couch, frowning and clutching her belly, while Toby barked in her direction, showing no signs of aggression, but with a dogged insistence that was deeply unsettling. Mark quickly grabbed Toby by the collar and pulled him away, trying to soothe him with gentle words. "Are you okay?" he asked Lucy anxiously. She nodded, but her face reflected the confusion that weighed on her. Mark noticed her voice tremble as she explained it was just another mild, momentary pain, something that felt like a sharper stab than usual. At that moment, Toby fell silent, but remained on guard, ears perked up. Lucy could feel her heart racing, partly from the discomfort, partly from her dog's behavior. Dr. Johnson's initial checkup had revealed nothing abnormal, but they still had to wait on the lab results. A part of Lucy longed for all this to be a false alarm, hoping Toby was merely reacting to the general tension around the baby's arrival. Yet another part of her wondered if Toby was indeed trying to warn her about something. The day ended with that lingering question unanswered. As night fell over the house, Lucy still felt a deep fatigue and a slight ache in her back. Mark made dinner and tried to distract her by discussing the baby names they'd been considering, but there was an unmistakable air of uncertainty. Toby lay off to one side of the living room, lifting his head every few minutes to look at Lucy, as if monitoring each breath she took. In that silent watchfulness, there lurked a mystery they both wanted to unravel before it was too late. Dawn had barely broken when Lucy felt her phone buzzing on the living room table. She looked up, exhaustion apparent in her face. She had spent days in this mix of anxiety and fatigue that refused to ease. Toby, lying at her feet, raised his head at the sound of the vibrating phone. Almost by reflex, Lucy slid her finger across the screen to answer. It was Julia, her colleague from school. "How are you doing, Lucy?" Julia asked, sounding concerned. "It's been a while since we heard from you. I just wanted to check that everything's all right with your pregnancy." Lucy thanked her for calling, feeling a fleeting sense of relief at her friend's voice. However, she avoided going into detail about Toby's incessant barking. She still wasn't sure it was wise to share that story, fearing she'd sound over the top or start unnecessary rumors. Instead, she admitted she felt a bit overwhelmed and tired, but offered no further explanation. "I have a strange feeling, Julia," Lucy said hesitantly. "I don't know how to describe it, just that something isn't quite right." "Do you mean at school, or about your health?" her friend pressed, alarmed. "My health, maybe," Lucy replied after a short pause. "But don't worry. The doctor already ran some tests, and for now, there's nothing alarming." Julia offered her support, reminding Lucy that if she needed anything, the school was still there for her, and that Julia herself could bring over materials or tasks so she wouldn't feel out of the loop. Lucy thanked her with a sigh, ending the call with a "I'll tell you about it later," which left Julia suspecting her friend was keeping something to herself. Not long after, Mark emerged from the bedroom with his tie askew and an expression that showed he was in a hurry. He had several important meetings at the office, along with a project that was running more behind schedule than expected. His work stress showed in the dark circles under his eyes and in his tense tone when he spoke to Lucy. "Are you okay?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his voice, checking his watch before downing the last cold sip of coffee. "I'm fine, but—" Lucy hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Julia just called. She was asking how I'm doing." Mark let out a sigh, as though he had no mental space for one more problem. He poured another cup of coffee and, while sipping it, noticed Toby coming over to Lucy to nuzzle her leg. That gesture, once a symbol of tenderness, now felt like a constant reminder of the tension hanging over them. "Sometimes I think we're overreacting with the dog," Mark remarked, putting on his jacket. "The medical tests haven't shown anything, and Toby is healthy. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place for answers." Lucy pursed her lips, hurt by her husband's indifference. She felt he was so absorbed in his responsibilities that he couldn't sense her daily anxiety. "This isn't overreacting, Mark," she answered, her voice unsteady. "I'm feeling pain, and Toby's acting strangely. I spend all day here, trying to stay calm, but I can't stop thinking that something might be wrong." Mark turned sharply. They stared at each other in silence, aware that this was shaping up to be their first serious conflict in a long time. Finally, he sighed, and before leaving, muttered, "I'm sorry, I've just been under a lot of pressure. We'll talk later, all right?" Lucy watched him go, while Toby let out a quiet whine and continued to watch her intently. A knot of frustration settled in her chest. It hurt to feel misunderstood, as though her fears were baseless worries. That same day, Casey came by to visit her sister. She arrived with a stack of printouts and her tablet, ready to share her latest internet findings. They settled in the kitchen as Casey spread out documents, recounting everything she'd read on dogs capable of detecting anything from multiple pregnancies to internal infections. "It's incredible," Casey said, pointing to a page of testimonials from various owners. "Some dogs bark specifically when they detect hormonal changes or the presence of an infection. These are real cases, reported by doctors and vets." Lucy listened with wide eyes. She wasn't sure whether to thank her sister for her dedication or be even more frightened by the possibility that Toby wasn't merely stressed, but was truly sensing a health issue. "Have you had any more discomfort?" Casey asked, watching her sister closely. "Just a bit of pain and tiredness. Nothing too serious," Lucy answered, hoping to sound nonchalant. "The blood tests haven't shown anything major, but I'm still waiting on a few more results." Casey encouraged her to be patient and look after herself. Even so, she couldn't fully hide her own unease. Toby's intense barking at her sister's belly didn't match any normal canine behavior Casey was aware of, and she had spent hours poring over articles about dogs' remarkable sense of smell. The afternoon passed slowly, with moments of silence. Lucy didn't want to alarm anyone else, yet she longed for some tranquility that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Casey left at dusk, promising to keep researching and begging Lucy to call her at the slightest change. When Mark returned, exhausted and with his tie undone, he apologized for his demeanor that morning. Lucy, not wanting to prolong the tension, accepted his apology without much comment. Still, the unease lingered, a gap between them that grew with each fresh doubt. Later that night, Lucy went back to her favorite chair, trying to find a comfortable position. Toby, as usual, approached slowly, sniffing the air with his head lowered. Lucy shut her eyes for a moment, feeling that wave of fatigue creeping up her back. Right then, Toby stopped in front of her, fixed his eyes on her belly, and let out a bark so loud that it reverberated through the living room walls. "Toby, please!" Lucy exclaimed, her voice quivering with frustration and nerves. The dog continued barking 3 or 4 more times without backing down or showing any submission. He looked like a sentinel standing guard, demanding attention to an invisible threat. Alarmed, Mark ran in from the next room. No words were needed. Both knew something was off, and Toby's barks only reinforced a growing suspicion that was getting harder to dismiss. This persistent behavior couldn't be a simple coincidence. The echo of that last bark faded away, but it resounded powerfully in Lucy's heart. She placed a hand on her belly, noticing her fingers trembling slightly. Could it be that Toby, from the very start, had been trying to warn her about something real? The doubt deepened, fueled by Casey's findings and the disquiet that was taking hold of her. That night, once silence returned to the house, Lucy couldn't ignore the voice telling her, with eerie clarity, that the truth would come to light sooner than they imagined. Early the next morning, the phone rang, waking Lucy from a restless sleep. She stirred in bed, her back aching, and felt her heart beat faster. Seeing the clinic's number on the screen, she had a feeling this wasn't just any call. She took a deep breath before answering, trying not to panic, even though she knew that same sense of foreboding had been hanging over her for days. "Lucy, good morning," Dr. Johnson greeted her in a serious tone. "I'm sorry to call so early, but I've got the initial results of your tests right here." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed and noticed Toby, who had been sleeping at her feet, raise his head and perk up his ears. For a moment she wished the call would simply confirm that everything was fine, but the doctor's words soon shattered her hopes. "Based on your blood and urine tests," the doctor went on, "there are signs of an infection. I can't pinpoint the exact cause yet, so we'll need further tests. I'd prefer if you came to the clinic today so we can assess the situation." Lucy remained silent for a moment, absorbing the news. She felt a sort of vertigo, like a hollow space opening in her stomach. This was the scenario she'd feared, especially after seeing how persistently Toby reacted to her belly. Now, the confirmation of an infection, though not yet definitively diagnosed, assembled into a puzzle of fears in her mind. "Doctor, I'll come as soon as I can," she finally replied, her voice shaky. "Thank you for letting me know." She hung up without noticing that Mark, right beside her, had also woken and was watching her with a mix of curiosity and concern. Meanwhile, Toby stood up and let out a soft whine, as if asking for an explanation no one could give. Lucy exhaled and placed a hand on her belly. "What happened?" Mark asked, frowning. Lucy explained what Dr. Johnson had said. She calmly recounted that although the test results were inconclusive, they pointed to the presence of an infection and that more comprehensive exams were needed to determine its nature and the best course of treatment. Mark's expression changed swiftly. His initial disbelief gave way to the worry he'd been trying to hold back. "Do you want me to go with you?" he offered at once, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Lucy felt a small wave of relief, seeing her husband offer to be by her side. She thought of the tension between them in recent weeks, the subtle arguments and work pressures that had kept him on edge. But this time, she sensed a shift in his gaze, a genuine alarm at the idea that something might threaten his wife and their baby. "Yes, please," Lucy answered, resting her head on Mark's shoulder. A stab of mixed fear and emotion shot through her. I guess Toby wasn't so wrong after all. After this admission, a telling silence filled the room. Lucy recalled every insistent bark, every growl from the dog whenever she sat in her armchair or whenever Mark tried to touch her belly. She also remembered the nights she went to bed with the vague feeling something was off, the sudden pangs and aches she had chalked up to normal pregnancy issues. Now she realized her body might have been sending her signals all along, signals Toby had somehow picked up on long before she did. Mark hurriedly changed clothes, cancelled the meeting he had scheduled for that morning, and got ready to accompany Lucy to the consultation. Before leaving, Lucy grabbed her purse and keys, trying to stay calm despite her growing anxiety. Toby lingered by the front door, watching their every movement with half-raised tail, in a posture that indicated complete vigilance. "Don't worry, Toby," Lucy murmured, leaning toward the dog to pat his head. "We'll be back soon." But as she tried to step forward, Toby planted himself on the threshold, blocking her way. He began a low growl, not quite a bark, but firm enough to make Lucy hesitate. Mark stopped mid-step, puzzled by the dog's behavior. "Easy there, boy," Mark said, coaxing Toby to move aside. "We're going to take care of Lucy. Don't worry." For an instant, Toby seemed unsure whether to obey or not. His eyes conveyed a mix of fear and protectiveness, an animal language Lucy interpreted as a desire to keep her from leaving. Maybe the dog sensed something serious was about to happen. Finally, Toby backed up a couple of steps, letting Lucy and Mark pass through the door. Even so, she had the impression that if Toby could talk, he'd have begged them not to leave. On the drive to the clinic, the atmosphere in the car felt dense. Mark drove with a furrowed brow, quietly repeating the things Dr. Johnson had mentioned, trying to imagine an optimistic outcome. Lucy, for her part, gazed out the window without focusing on anything in particular. She didn't want to think the worst, but she was terribly scared. At nearly 8 months along, the margin for error was small, and any complication could be serious. Once they arrived at the building, they headed up to the doctor's office. Dr. Johnson greeted them in the waiting area, looking serious but calm. He asked Lucy to come in at once, leaving Mark for a moment to handle paperwork at the reception desk. In the exam room, Lucy sat down and listened as the doctor asked her to describe all her symptoms in detail. She spoke about the stabs of back pain, the fatigue that had worsened over the past few weeks, and the mild pressure in her abdomen. "The tests show signs of infection," Dr. Johnson repeated, examining a folder closely. "I don't want to alarm you, but we have to find out the source. In these cases, we need to rule out conditions like chorioamnionitis or other pregnancy-related infections. We'll schedule further tests as soon as possible." Just hearing the word chorioamnionitis brought a lump to Lucy's throat. She was beginning to grasp how serious the situation could be. She fixed her gaze on the white wall, her pulse throbbing in her ears. When Dr. Johnson assured her that the best approach was to act early, she drew a breath, trying to believe everything would turn out fine. A few minutes later, Mark came into the room and took a seat next to Lucy. The doctor went over the explanation again, advising them to stay alert and follow basic recommendations for rest, hydration, and monitoring her temperature. He also mentioned that, in the worst-case scenario, they might have to consider delivering the baby early if the infection endangered either the mother or the baby. "We won't let it escalate," Dr. Johnson said, with a confident tone Lucy wanted to cling to like a lifeline. "The important thing is that we've caught warning signs in time." After their consultation, Lucy and Mark left more serious than ever. Neither of them stated the obvious, that Toby had been warning them for weeks that something was wrong. Now that suspicion had taken shape in the lab results. Their already cloudy fears and doubts turned darker, yet they also felt an urge to act decisively and carefully. When they finally got home, Toby greeted them with the same watchful look. He approached Lucy, sniffed her belly, and let out a soft whimper that expressed the same worry both she and Mark felt inside. They still didn't have a definitive diagnosis, but the atmosphere was now charged with palpable anxiety. That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. Lucy and Mark barely spoke to each other. She settled into the couch carefully, stroking her belly and feeling the back pains become a constant shadow of ache. Toby lay down near the door, as if fearing that Lucy might leave again and he wouldn't be able to stop her. And so, with tension mounting, they both realized that guesswork was no longer enough. It was time to face the issue and do everything possible to protect the life growing inside Lucy. Lucy awoke with heavy eyelids and a sharp pain in her back that could no longer be attributed merely to the typical discomfort of pregnancy. 2 days had passed since Dr. Johnson warned them about a severe possible infection, and in that short time, Lucy's condition had worsened rapidly. She was running intermittent fevers, and her fatigue was so overwhelming that even climbing the stairs felt like a monumental challenge. Mark, for his part, stayed close by her side, weighed down by guilt for not having taken Toby's barking more seriously from the start. That morning, the phone rang again at an early hour. Lucy was in the living room, leaning back in her favorite armchair, with Toby stretched out at her feet. Mark, already awake, picked up the phone with a tense expression, certain it must be more news from Dr. Johnson or the clinic. "Hello?" he said, voice trembling. "Good morning, Mark," came Dr. Johnson's unmistakable voice. "I'm sorry to call so early, but we have conclusive results from Lucy's latest tests." Mark looked at his wife, who watched him with a blend of fear and hope. Feeling the weight of her stare, he gripped the phone a bit tighter. "We've confirmed that Lucy has a severe infection," the doctor went on. "All signs point to chorioamnionitis, an intra-amniotic infection that poses risks to both mother and baby." His words landed like a crushing weight in Mark's ears. Until now, he'd clung to the hope that maybe it was something they could treat at home with antibiotics. But hearing chorioamnionitis left no doubt. They were facing a dangerous situation. Mark swallowed hard and felt a hollow tightness settle in his chest. "I understand," he managed, his voice cracking. "What do we do now?" Dr. Johnson responded swiftly, speaking in a way that tried to convey reassurance, yet hinted at the urgency of the matter. He explained that Lucy needed to go straight to the hospital for IV antibiotics and close monitoring. He also mentioned the possibility of inducing labor or performing an emergency C-section, depending on how the infection progressed over the coming hours or days. When Mark hung up, he felt his strength slip away. He hurried over to where Lucy sat, full of anxiety. Toby, alert, pricked his ears as Mark entered the room. Mark knelt beside his wife, took her hand, and forced down his grief before speaking the words that confirmed their worst fears. "Lucy, it's serious. The doctor says it could be chorioamnionitis. We have to go to the hospital now." Lucy's eyes instantly welled with tears. For a second, she seemed to hold her breath, as if summoning the strength to face what she'd just heard. She'd spent weeks coping with stabbing pains, low fever, and a fatigue she couldn't ignore. But she'd never imagined danger would appear so suddenly. "So soon," she finally managed, looking anxiously at her swollen belly. "There's still a little over a month to go. I never expected this." Mark carefully wrapped his arms around her, partly to comfort her, and partly to steady his own trembling. He thought of Toby and how he'd dismissed the dog's early warning barks as mere canine fuss. A surge of guilt rattled him from head to toe. "I'm sorry, Lucy. I really am," he murmured, vision blurred by sorrow. "Maybe Toby was warning us all this time and I just didn't listen." With her chin resting on his shoulder, Lucy couldn't hold back a sob. The air felt heavy, laden with a mix of terror and urgency. She tried to regain her composure. Freezing in panic wouldn't help protect her baby. She needed every ounce of strength to get to the hospital and fight for both their health. "Don't dwell on that now," she whispered, attempting a shaky smile to encourage him. "Help me pack. We have to go." Gently, Mark helped Lucy stand. The fever and pain made her unsteady on her feet, so it took them several minutes to reach the main bedroom. Once there, Lucy sat on the bed while Mark pulled a small suitcase from the closet, the one they'd packed for the birth, though they hadn't expected to use it so soon. Seeing the tiny clothes meant for the baby, Lucy felt a lump in her throat. The outfits, the diapers, and the soft cotton blanket all seemed to belong to a future that shouldn't have arrived yet. The silence was broken by Toby, who slowly entered the bedroom. From the doorway, he watched them with worried eyes, following Lucy's every movement. Noticing her labored breathing, the dog let out a faint growl, barely audible, yet as if pleading with them to stop. For Mark, that sound was further confirmation that Toby had sensed the threat long before. "Easy, Toby," Lucy whispered, attempting a smile despite the tension. "I'll be all right." Yet she felt a chill ripple through her as she spoke those words, knowing the road ahead would not be easy. Dr. Johnson had been clear. The infection threatened not only her pregnancy, but her own health. She caressed her belly, hoping her baby could feel the promise she was making to fight for him. While Mark gathered medical documents and readied a folder with the latest reports, Lucy packed a couple of changes of clothes and some personal items into a suitcase. Her pulse raced, and a sharp pain stabbed at her back. Toby inched closer, placing himself at the threshold as though wanting to block their exit, just as he had done days earlier. Though he didn't bark, his posture spoke volumes. He didn't want Lucy to leave home. "We have to go, Toby," Lucy said softly. "I'm sorry, but it's for the best." The dog's eyes flickered with uncertainty, almost as though he understood the necessity of their departure. Mark came over, took Lucy's hand, and kissed her forehead. There was no more time to lose. The infection could spread and complicate matters even further if they didn't get specialized care as soon as possible. In that moment, Lucy felt as if she was standing on the edge of a cliff. Her heart clenched, and her gaze locked on Toby, who remained by the doorway, motionless. It was a gesture laden with meaning, a mirror reflecting the worry everyone in that home shared. No one spoke another word. Only Lucy's shaky sigh and the pounding of their hearts could be heard, aware they were steps away from facing the greatest challenge of their lives. Lucy's arrival at the hospital was as sudden as it was distressing. The moment she set foot in the ER, nurses whisked her onto a gurney and took her straight to the observation room, where Dr. Johnson and a team of specialists awaited to examine her. Mark's heart pounded as he watched his wife struggle for breath, feverish and drained from the last few days. Despite the rush and tension, Lucy tried to keep her composure, clinging to the thought that she was in the best possible place to safeguard the baby. Within minutes, she was put on an IV to administer antibiotics and painkillers that could slow the infection. Dr. Johnson, accompanied by a hospital gynecologist, spoke to Mark at the side of the gurney, explaining the situation gravely. They needed to stop the infection as soon as possible and determine whether it would be safest to deliver the baby early. A cesarean or induced labor weren't off the table, given the risk that chorioamnionitis posed for both mother and child. "What matters," the doctor stressed, "is to monitor Lucy and the baby closely. We have to see if the antibiotics work immediately or whether we'll have to act more urgently." Mark nodded, feeling overwhelmed by a rush of conflicting emotions. When he looked at his wife, he saw her glassy eyes and the trace of fear she tried to hide behind an exhausted smile. In that moment, he thought of Toby and the guilt that gnawed at him for not paying attention to the dog's many warning barks. Before long, the hallway filled with familiar voices. Casey, Lucy's sister, arrived, breathing heavily and with determined steps. She was carrying a folder of the research she'd done on the connection between dogs and human health. Seeing Lucy lying on the gurney, with an IV in her arm, Casey approached carefully and took her hand. "I'm here," she murmured, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Don't worry, everything will be all right." Lucy forced a small smile. She knew Casey had spent time and effort searching for answers, and though the situation was critical, she couldn't help feeling a pang of gratitude to see her there, supporting her. For a moment, both sisters recalled the talks in which Casey insisted dogs could sense illnesses before humans did. Now, heartbreakingly, that theory was proving all too true. Meanwhile, Mark made a quick phone call to the office to speak with Victor, his co-worker and friend, who was already aware of Lucy's delicate condition. Speaking out of sheer concern, Mark dispensed with any formality and explained he would be away from work indefinitely. Moved by what he heard, Victor promised to take over the urgent project and handle whatever might arise. "Forget about the company entirely," Victor said, his tone unusually serious. "Your priority now is Lucy and the baby. If you need anything, I'm right here." That gesture of solidarity lifted some of the weight pressing on Mark's shoulders. He needed to focus on Lucy's health, free from the stresses of deadlines and pending tasks. Even so, he couldn't stop wondering how everything had spiraled so quickly. It wasn't long before Julia, Lucy's colleague from school, rushed into the waiting room. She had a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and a bag stuffed with papers and pamphlets in the other. Moving briskly, she stopped in front of Mark, barely holding back tears as she asked about her friend's condition. "The school sent me to help with anything you need," she explained quietly. "I've spoken to the administration, and they'll do whatever it takes to cover Lucy's leave for as long as necessary. We want her to recover without any worries." Mark, overwhelmed, thanked her sincerely. Knowing Lucy wouldn't have to deal with work issues in the midst of this crisis was a huge relief. Julia soon stepped into Lucy's room, where she found her half asleep, yet aware of her surroundings. Gently, she covered Lucy's feet with a blanket and kissed her forehead, promising that everything at school would be under control. Amid all the commotion came Maria, their neighbor, who had so often shared her homemade remedies and selfless help. She brought a small bag of herbal teas and a little vial of drops, which she swore could help boost immunity. Though the hospital staff looked askance at these alternative cures, Maria remained unfazed. It was enough for her to speak to Mark and Casey, assuring them of her faith in nature and in the shared strength between humans and animals. "I don't want to bother the medical team," she said, noticing a few skeptical stares. "But here's something in case it helps." Casey, in gratitude, took the bag and set it aside, promising they'd find a good use for it while following the doctor's orders. That small, simple exchange completed the little circle of help that had formed around Lucy, tying together the various threads that had started weeks earlier. As the day wore on, the doctors closely monitored Lucy's temperature and her response to the antibiotics. Several nurses ran routine tests and checked the fetal heartbeat to ensure the baby was safe. Casey, Julia, Maria, and even Victor, via phone, became a vital emotional support for both Lucy and Mark, reminding them they weren't going through this alone. By nightfall, Dr. Johnson assembled his team to discuss the next step. If the infection didn't subside soon, they would have to advance the delivery or opt for a cesarean, as continuing the pregnancy under those conditions posed a significant risk to both mother and child. Mark, seated by Lucy's bed, gripped her hand tightly, never looking away from her eyes. "Whatever happens, we're going to get through this," he said, though his voice wavered. "Trust that everything will turn out all right." Lucy nodded, letting the final tears of an exhausting day slip onto her pillow. She thought of Toby, of how that bundle of fur had warned them of danger through his insistent barking. Now it was just a matter of time before the doctors decided on the proper course of action. The atmosphere in the room brimmed with expectancy, as if everyone were holding their breath in anticipation of what was coming. That night, Mark stayed by Lucy's side without leaving once, while their friends and relatives took turns visiting, offering help. Their faces reflected communal worry, but also a steadfast hope. The combined efforts of everyone present marked the threshold of an inevitable climax, the moment when Lucy's life and her baby's would collide with the greatest medical challenge they had ever faced. Morning's first light filtered through the hospital window, revealing a restive scene steeped in uncertainty. Lucy had already spent 2 days there, battling the infection with antibiotics and strict bed rest, but she wasn't improving as quickly as the medical team had hoped. Every few hours, Dr. Johnson and his staff checked Lucy's vitals and tested the baby's condition through monitors and blood work. The fever barely subsided, and Lucy was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Mark had barely slept, since it all took a turn for the worse. He remained steadfast at the side of Lucy's bed, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement. He could feel her labored breathing, saw the sweat forming on her brow whenever her temperature spiked. Still, Lucy refused to lose her composure, clinging to the hope that her strength and the doctor's efforts would be enough to ward off the danger looming over the baby. By mid-morning, everything changed abruptly. Dr. Johnson received test results indicating that certain infection markers had risen, meaning the antibiotics weren't containing the infection quickly enough. Lucy's energy levels were dropping, and the team feared the infection could spread to her bloodstream. When the doctor outlined the situation to Mark, the tension became palpable. "The risk to mother and baby is growing by the hour," he explained, setting aside the stack of test results. "We believe an emergency C-section is our best option." Weary and glassy-eyed from the fever, Lucy jolted upon hearing the decision. She had come to terms with the possibility of an early delivery, but this sounded more definitive and, of course, more frightening. Dr. Johnson approached the bed, gently explaining that a cesarean would be the safest path. They hoped to save the baby and avoid complications that could seriously endanger Lucy's life. "We can't promise it will be simple," the doctor warned, "but our team is ready to intervene and minimize the risks." A cold knot settled in Mark's stomach. He wanted to stay strong for Lucy, but the fear of losing her, or their child, was suffocating. Outside the room, Casey and Julia exchanged worried glances, fully aware how serious a premature C-section under such conditions could be. Maria, the neighbor, had offered prayers and lit candles, convinced that every spiritual gesture, no matter how small, might help. Far away, Victor sent text messages and called periodically, always with hopeful words. Back home, Toby seemed to sense everything. Since the early hours, he had been restless, whining as he circled the living room and scratched at the front door, as if he wanted to race off to the hospital. The family members caring for him tried to calm him with petting and his favorite toy, but the dog persisted. His distressed whimpers echoed the fear unfolding miles away. While the operating room was being prepped, a nurse helped Lucy change into a hospital gown and remove any metal objects. Mark, at her side, felt her trembling, not just from the fever, but from nerves as well. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, whispering that he wouldn't leave her. Even so, he knew that inside the OR, he'd only be allowed to stay for a short while, and then he'd have to wait outside during the most critical moment. Lucy was wheeled down a long, brightly lit corridor. The white fluorescent lamps accentuated how pale she was. She kept her gaze on the ceiling, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Each second, her heartbeat thundered in her chest, knowing that her life and the baby's now depended on the medical team. When they finally entered the operating room, Dr. Johnson and a specialized obstetrician greeted Lucy with a look of confidence. Several nurses moved with precision, prepping instruments, checking monitors, and adjusting the anesthesia dosage. The air was charged with a mix of professional calm and palpable tension. Chorioamnionitis was no small matter, requiring a swift yet meticulous surgical intervention. Mark, dressed in a disposable gown, face mask and cap, held Lucy's hand for a moment before the anesthesiologist began the procedure. Again and again, he told her he loved her and that everything would be all right. The doctors gave him a few seconds to say goodbye before asking him to wait in another room. That was the hardest moment for Mark, letting go of his wife's hand, watching the surgeons gather around the operating table, and knowing that, for the next few minutes, his entire world hung by a thread. Inside the OR, Lucy felt both dizzy and relieved as the regional anesthesia took effect. She couldn't move her legs or feel the incision's pain, but she remained conscious of what was happening around her. The obstetrician began the incision with a steady hand, while Dr. Johnson closely monitored the mother's and baby's vital signs. The antiseptic smell and the faint buzzing of the machines created a surreal ambiance, like a scene out of a movie. From time to time, a nurse dabbed the sweat from Lucy's forehead, and she could only hope her recovery would be quick enough not to endanger the baby. She felt her stomach twist at the thought of possible complications, the infection spreading further, the risk of the baby being born with respiratory issues due to prematurity, or the chance of hemorrhaging. Still, the surgeons worked with a steady, confident rhythm. Long minutes passed, though for Lucy they felt eternal, until an assistant announced that the uterine cavity was exposed. The obstetrician, in direct communication with the anesthesiologist, carefully proceeded to remove the baby. Lucy didn't dare move, but she felt a sudden emptiness in her belly. A few seconds later, a sharp cry rang out, the piercing wail of a newborn clinging to life. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. A wave of emotion shook her from head to toe, briefly wiping away all pain and fever. Dr. Johnson quickly checked the baby's condition and handed him to a pediatrician, who dried him off and examined him on the newborn station. The baby's strong, insistent crying echoed around the room, a very good sign. Though tiny, the premature infant moved his arms and legs with surprising vigor. "Lucy, he's alive! Your baby is all right!" the obstetrician declared, making sure she heard him clearly. They stabilized the baby without delay and placed him in a makeshift incubator for rapid transfer to the neonatal unit. Meanwhile, Lucy couldn't stop crying. She felt overwhelming relief, infinite love, and a lingering terror mingling in her heart. There was still the crucial step of ensuring that the infection hadn't caused lasting harm to her own body. Dr. Johnson continued working, examining her uterus and other internal tissues. Fortunately, the procedure didn't reveal any severe complications at that stage, and the antibiotics appeared to be containing the infection enough to avoid a tragic outcome. Before long, they closed the incision with sutures, controlled the bleeding, and monitored her vital signs. Lucy didn't lose consciousness, though exhaustion and the medication kept her in a drowsy haze. At last, they moved her to the recovery room. Mark rushed in, pale-faced and teary-eyed. One of the surgeons gave him a quick summary. The baby was premature but breathing on his own, and they had taken him to the neonatal area for observation. Relief flooded Mark's face, and he immediately went over to Lucy's bedside. She offered him a weak smile, her eyes red-rimmed. "We did it, Mark," she murmured, struggling to speak, feeling short of breath. "He's here, and we're both alive." Mark couldn't hold back his tears. He stroked Lucy's cheek and kissed her forehead, silently thanking everyone involved in making that moment possible. There was still uncertainty about the hours ahead, concerning Lucy's recovery and the resilience of a premature infant. But that partial victory was enough to keep their hope alive. Meanwhile, back home, Toby stirred in the yard, letting out a soft whimper that shifted into a brief howl. The family caring for him noticed how suddenly the dog fell quiet, as though he'd been gripped by a sudden calm. No one could say for sure, but in that moment, Toby seemed to sense that his owner's life and that of her baby had just been saved. The days following the emergency C-section were a mix of relief and sleepless nights for Lucy and Mark. Time stretched through nurse rounds, medical checkups, and non-stop monitoring. Despite being premature, the baby responded better than expected to the care in the neonatal unit. Gradually, he started to regulate his temperature and his vital signs stabilized, proof of a strength that surprised even the medical team. Lucy, meanwhile, remained on a strict course of antibiotics to combat the infection, drawing emotional comfort from the frequent visits of Casey, Julia, and Maria. Mark rarely left her side except to coordinate details with the doctors, trying to convey a calm he himself was desperate to feel. One morning, Dr. Johnson walked into Lucy's room carrying an envelope and wearing a measured smile. After checking her vital signs and reviewing the latest neonatal report, he explained that her progress was promising enough to discharge her in a couple of days on the condition that she rest at home and come in for regular checkups. Hearing that news lifted a heavy weight from Lucy's chest. She would finally go home, and she would be taking her baby with her. When the day arrived, Mark helped Lucy dress in the comfortable outfit Casey had brought her. The baby, still small and delicate, was wrapped in a soft blanket and a knitted cap. As they left the room, the nurses and doctors bid them farewell with discreet applause and best wishes. Lucy thanked each of them with a heart overflowing with gratitude, cradling her newborn, who slept peacefully, as though he sensed they were headed for a more peaceful time. On the drive home, Mark was extra cautious at the wheel. Lucy's eyes stayed on the tiny baby in the car seat, mesmerized by his gentle breathing, and the faint twitch of his little hands. She recalled every terrifying moment, the fevers, the pain, Dr. Johnson's worried look, and Toby's barking, which had started weeks before. She couldn't help but smile at the almost miraculous foresight of her dog and at how, in the beginning, they had all underestimated his frantic warnings. At last, they pulled into the driveway. Mark carefully retrieved the suitcase while Lucy carried the baby against her chest. They opened the front door, and before they could take another step, Toby appeared in the foyer, tail held high and eyes eager for the reunion. Lucy felt a lump in her throat as she realized her faithful companion wasn't barking or showing any distress. Instead, he approached quietly and sniffed the air, as though confirming his owner and the baby were safe. Mark knelt down and stroked the dog's head affectionately. "Thank you, Toby," he murmured, gazing into the dog's dark eyes. "You warned us when no one else did. You're the real hero of this story." The next few hours passed in a peaceful atmosphere of joy. Casey arrived with a broad smile, giving Toby a pat on the head and thanking him aloud for insisting something was wrong. She carried with her a book of stories about protective dogs, convinced Toby and Lucy's experience belonged among those accounts. Casey felt legitimate pride in her research finally being validated, and she was quick to share with anyone who'd listen how Toby had saved 2 lives by alerting them to an unseen danger. Julia also dropped by later in the afternoon. She entered quietly, mindful of the sleeping newborn, and the moment she saw Lucy on the couch holding the baby, she gasped with relief. She kissed Lucy's forehead and asked if she needed anything to ease her recovery. Then she mentioned how the school had taken care of all her classes without any problems and that they were more than happy to give her all the time she needed to fully recover. Lucy smiled gratefully, glad she wouldn't have to worry about work until she was ready. Meanwhile, Mark got a call from Victor, his co-worker, who had successfully wrapped up the urgent project. He praised Mark for the courage he'd shown during the last few days and assured him that the office was there for whatever he might need, reminding Mark not to come back until his family situation allowed. Holding the phone to his ear, Mark looked at Lucy and the baby and felt fortunate to have the support of his workplace during such a delicate time. Finally, Maria the neighbor arrived, carrying a tray of homemade cookies and a small good luck charm. She was convinced that nature speaks through animals and that Toby's story was living proof of it. After congratulating Lucy and making sure she was in good hands, Maria left them with a sincere blessing, underscoring how crucial it can be to heed the signals the world sometimes whispers to us. With the house now calm, the baby slept in a makeshift bassinet near the couch as Lucy gazed at him with devotion. Toby lay quietly nearby, not making a sound, as if his mission as guardian were now complete. Mark put his arm around Lucy's shoulders and kissed her gently, taking in the scene with a mix of relief and happiness. There, in the soft glow of dusk, the family came together, mother, father, baby, and dog, bound by a bond stronger than ever. The silence filling the living room was no longer that of fear and uncertainty, but of the peace that follows a difficult trial. Lucy petted Toby's back, then looked at Mark and at the sleeping baby, allowing herself to feel the magnitude of that moment. They had been to the brink and back, and now gratitude radiated in every shared breath. It was a perfect image, a renewed family, a 4-legged hero, and a future full of promises that, this time, woke with calm and hope. Toby's presence went far beyond that of a mere pet. He had become a vital member of the household. His persistent barks revealed a deep bond with Lucy, a connection that transcended routine companionship. Through his instincts, Toby had transformed into a messenger warning of an invisible threat, saving the lives of 2 precious family members. This protective act showed how a dog can go beyond simple affection and play to fulfill the role of a true guardian, attuned to the slightest changes in those he loves most. His loyalty, devotion, and desire to care for his owner proved the power of the unconditional love animals can offer. Toby's story reminds us that sometimes the most important signals come from those who don't speak our language, but show us, loud and clear, the strength of their feelings. In the end, Toby didn't just protect this home's core. He fortified the family ties that hold it together, teaching Mark and Lucy the beauty of listening with their hearts. His silent intervention, unexpected in its significance, confirmed that a family is built day by day, with mutual care and understanding, and that animals, far from being mere companions, can become real heroes at the most critical moments. And that's our story. Thank you for staying with us until the end and sharing this moment. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more content filled with emotion and hope. See you soon, and take good care.